Hi folks, this is Pastor Sarah, and this video is a kids' church video for upper elementary kids for the month of July. Our story for this month is a parable. And a parable is a special kind of story that Jesus used to teach people. This parable shows up in more than one gospel, and it's a parable that helps us understand the kingdom of God. But before we get to that, I want to show you some of my garden. You might remember that way back in April, I showed you some videos of places in my garden. I showed you some radish sprouts, places where I had planted radish seeds and they were beginning to sprout. I showed you some lettuce sprouts. Those were even smaller than the radish sprouts. They were teeny tiny, smaller than a fingernail. And I showed you some stems from milkweed. They were dried up, dead-looking stems that I just left there so that I would remember where I planted them last fall. And I was not at all sure that the milkweed would grow again this year. But I told you that if it started growing, I would make sure to let you know. And look at this. This is the milkweed. I have 3 stems of milkweed that have grown this year from milkweed that I planted last fall. I had given up on the milkweed, to be honest. All the other flowers in that part of my garden had come up. I could recognize them. They were getting taller, and I wasn't seeing anything back where I'd put that milkweed. But I didn't mow just in case something was growing under that grass that I couldn't see. And sure enough, now there are 3 milkweed plants that are growing. It makes me really happy. Here are some of the other updates. Here's the lettuce. It is quite a bit bigger than a fingernail now. It's a great big nice head of romaine lettuce, almost like what you would see at the grocery store. And these are my radishes. They actually are way past the point where I can eat the roots. I enjoyed the radish greens and the radish roots, but I've let some of them keep growing, and you can see the flowers on them and these seed pods. Aren't those wild looking? They look almost like beans, but I'm going to let some of them keep growing until the seeds are fully grown so that I can save the seeds for next year. The parable that we are going to talk about this month is a parable about a seed. The seed that Jesus talked about was a mustard seed. Have you ever seen one? Here's a mustard seed from my kitchen. I use them for cooking Indian food sometimes. But see how tiny it is? Jesus said the mustard seed is one of the smallest seeds. It's tiny. But when you plant it in the ground, it grows and it becomes a plant that gets big enough that birds can come and build their nests in it. Do you have any plants in your garden that are big enough for birds to build their nests in them? I don't think my lettuce is big enough for birds to build their nests, but the tomatoes are getting pretty big. And I have blueberry bushes and a mulberry bush, and I have some trees, and that's where the birds most enjoy building their nests. I see a lot of nests up in my Douglas fir trees. I wonder why Jesus used a mustard seed to talk about the kingdom of God. What is the kingdom of God anyway? Some Bibles use the phrase the kingdom of heaven. And I think that's extra confusing. Because usually when we talk about heaven, we mean someplace that's different than where we live now. Heaven is like a place that people go to after they die, right? But when Jesus was telling these parables, he was talking more about a kind of world that we can live in now. I think the kingdom of God isn't a different place. It's a different way of living. Have you ever noticed that even in the same country, there can be lots of different ways to live? Like in our country, there are some places where people live on farms. There are some places where people live in trailers. There are some places where people live in great big tall skyrise apartments. There are some places where everyone has a big backyard. There are other places where there are only very small yards. There are some neighborhoods where all the houses look really similar to each other. And then there are some neighborhoods where every single house looks completely different from the other ones around it. There are a lot of different ways to live. And I think the kingdom of God is talking about the choices that we make about how we live in this world. When we make choices based on what we think Jesus would do, when we choose to live our lives in ways that reflect God's love, when we decide to care about the things that we think God cares about, all of those are ways that we can choose to live in the kingdom of God. I don't know about you, but sometimes I get a little bit discouraged. Sometimes it feels like there are problems in the world that are so big that there's no way that I can possibly make a difference. I'm just one person. For instance, you've probably heard at school about climate change or pollution. Those are problems that affect the whole world. And it's hard to believe that my choice to not use straws as often or to use less plastic in my house, it's hard to believe that those small differences are actually going to change anything in the world because the problem is so much bigger than me. I think that this parable is giving us hope that small changes we make really can become a big change for the world. The kingdom of God might not look big and powerful. A lot of times the choices that God calls us to make are small changes, or maybe big changes that make our lives look or feel smaller. Choosing to spend less money on a car so that we have money to do kind things for other people. Or choosing to buy our vegetables from a farm that's close to our house instead of vegetables that were grown halfway around the world. That might make our life look a little bit smaller. But those small things can become something that's large and that makes a difference for the world. That little mustard seed sprouts and becomes something big enough for birds to build their nests, to have a home, to lay their eggs, to raise their babies, to teach them how to fly. All because of a tiny little mustard seed. I wonder what kind of choices you are making that look small, but that will become something big and beautiful and life-giving for our world. You might not need to know what they are. I think that's one of the most mysterious and confusing, but also maybe wonderful things about the kingdom of God. We don't always know what those seeds are. We don't always know what is growing in our lives that will be a gift to the world. But it's there. That seed is planted in your life. God is helping you every day make small decisions that are going to make a difference for our world. And that gives me a lot of hope. That is the kingdom of God among us. Get outside today, enjoy your garden, or go to a park, see some green things, help something grow. I miss you, and I hope that you're having a good summer.